Now I'd like to welcome to the show Professor Alan Mendenhall of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University and Executive Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy. Welcome to Free the Economy, Alan.
Thanks. I really appreciate the invitation.
Now, first, if there is anyone who is not already familiar with university, I can't hardly imagine that, but tell us, give us a little background on Troy University down there in Alabama and how the Johnson Center fits into the whole mission for the university and the business school.
Well, Troy University is an interesting campus in that we have actually four campuses throughout the state: Dothan, Phoenix City, Troy, and Montgomery. We have about 16,000 students, and that's split between graduate students and undergraduates. I am Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy within the Sorrell College of Business. And the Johnson Center is a free market research and educational center that runs an MA program in economics. And we do all sorts of educational programming throughout the state and region, and we do work in public policy. We launched something last year, about a year ago, called the Free Enterprise Scholars Program. This was the new program that generated such attention. And we marketed it as sort of targeting woke businesses. And what that means in practice is that we do a lot of research in the area of ESG and capital markets and figuring out why it is that corporations have adopted ESG or trend toward leftward politics when, not so long ago, corporations were much more conservative. They were much friendlier toward free market principles. And so we try to examine that drift and explain it and produce research on the subject.
Well, yeah, and so if you go to the website for the Johnson Center, it mentions specifically focus on free markets and individual liberty, and I wonder how you sort of led into that, but how unusual that is among business schools today. I know my old colleague Fred Smith, so our founder here at CEI, often used to talk about the state of business education in the United States, and lament that some of them seem to be turned into anti-business schools, where students are taught first and foremost to apologize for wanting to make money in the first place. How have you seen that role, the sort of business schools in America? How has that changed over time?
Well, I think that the drift mirrors sort of the drift in corporate America, and I don't think that's by accident. For example, our accreditor, AACSB, the accreditor of many universities in the United States, is an international accreditor, and it ties some of its accreditation standards to UN Sustainability Development Goals and to other sort of international standards and bodies of work. And so you can see a lot of the drift occurring through just basic accreditation, through the European Investment Bank and the streamlined energy and carbon reporting standards and different French energy transition laws, and all these different organizations that are sort of coordinated by the United Nations that work in concert to operationalize ESG and other sorts of anti-business practices, such as the shift from the shareholder to the stakeholder model of governance that was supported by the World Economic Forum and the Business Roundtable, among other things. Sort of the Business Roundtable in 2019 infamously redefined the purpose of corporations away from profit maximization and toward doing good for the world, and as if corporations didn't already do good for the world. And one thing you see with AACSB standards that I find to be really interesting is they've got this social impact criteria, and you have to demonstrate what your social impact is. And to me, that's interesting because it sort of undermines the entire project of academia by suggesting that teaching, researching, and writing themselves have no social impact. What you professors are doing doesn't have a societal impact. Therefore, we have to create this new category, and you have to go out and do these other things to show that you're having a societal impact, because teaching, researching, writing, they're just not enough.
Well, sure, you've produced thousands of highly educated graduates, but what have you done for us lately?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So this that is actually a really fascinating answer because I think it's something that I've been seeing, and certainly a friend of mine, a previous guest on the podcast, Russ Green of Stand Together, has made this comment as well about ESG standards, this sort of new ethics for business, leadership, supposedly leadership and investing, that we've seen plenty of previous versions of this where business leaders have said, "Oh, well, here's the new ethical standards for business in our day and age." Uh, you had business leaders 100 years ago, right, saying things like that and getting together at conferences and making speeches and being community leaders. All the way back in the 1950s, the term corporate social responsibility, became a sort of buzzword that eventually became more popular. But with ESG, it's really the first version of this in multiple cycles over, almost a century that has been explicitly from the very beginning, from its founding, coordinated with these sort of international uh, organizations, right? The United Nations and all of its various affiliates, and the sort of transnational governance. The idea that every corporation, not just in the country but in the world, needs to sort of inherit its mission and goals from what people in New York or London or Geneva have decided are the best, most important things. So rather than coming up from individual business leaders who are good people who have decided I'm going to act in an ethical manner, it's sort of imposed down on us from
Right.
this sort of handful of people who are the self-selected, highly educated, elite policymakers, which to me is a completely upside down way of expecting to operate an economy in a free society.
Well, and if you look at how ESG spreads, it's not through bottom up processes. It is through this coordination of top down institutions and sort of the collapse of the distinction between public and private actors. I mean, the Who Cares Wins conference of 2004 that sort of ushered in the term ESG was hosted by the United Nations and the government of Switzerland. And if you look at companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the so-called big three asset managers, they're making their money off of investing government money. We're talking about government bonds, in particular municipal bonds. We're talking about sovereign wealth funds. We're talking about state and federal pension money. This is all money that is government money. And that's how they're generating their wealth. And in many cases, the beneficiaries of that money, for example, if you're a state pensioner, if you're a public school teacher, or you're just any kind of state employee, you may not know the way your sort of state treasurer is investing your money and what causes you might be indirectly subsidizing through those investments that are being managed by, say, BlackRock. I mean, certain states have divested from BlackRock, West Virginia, Florida, and so forth. But it's highly problematic because not just from an ethical standpoint with breaches of fiduciary duty and conflicts of interest and all the rest, but also from sort of a free market perspective. We're not talking about purely free markets here. We're talking about companies that are investing government money that wouldn't have even been there to begin with on a purely private market system.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and this often comes up with some of the say like environmental aspects to ESG investing, the E in ESG. A lot of people will say, well, I'd like the idea of an investment fund that's good for the environment, but the question is, will it deliver as strong a return as a traditional fund? So that's certainly a concern. But as you sort of hinted at, there's another layer to this, which is even if that even if we could just sort of grant for the sake of argument that an ESG affiliated fund is going to perform as well as a non-ESG fund, uh, it's not clear whether everyone who is an investor in a big asset management fund is going to even agree with the policies put forward in the first place. Right. So it's sort of
Yes.
assumed that like, oh, well, we all want cleaner air and water, so it's fine that, we sort of inject these non-financial things into it. But the ESG policymaking and investment guidelines are full of things like, uh, penalizing states for passing pro-life laws, for divesting from gun companies, from boycotting Israel, to all sorts of other things that are very controversial, right?
That's
So
right.
it's not, the question is not, oh, well, will my anti-Israel fund do as well as a non-anti-Israel fund? Maybe I don't actually want to be in an anti-Israel fund in the first place, right?
Mhm. Well, and a couple things is, historically, most investors were individuals or household investors, but now we've seen the rise of these institutional investors. And so they manage money in a different way. But if an individual wants to invest in an exchange traded fund or some type of mutual fund that is ESG weighted, or they want to put their money in and ESG portfolios that pool from certain companies that are doing certain things, they have that right to do so, and they can lose money if they want. If they want to put their money in underperforming funds, by all means, that there's no restriction on doing that. But that is not what is occurring with the investment of state pension money. These are not people that are voluntarily choosing to put their money in these funds for those reasons. These are political actors putting state money, uh, oftentimes at odds with the values and interests of the beneficiaries of those funds, who technically are, at the end of the day, the owners of the funds. So there's that. The other piece that we haven't spoken about is that these large asset management firms then go back in and they buy large numbers of shares in publicly traded companies, and they become shareholders themselves. And that's when they engage corporate boards of directors. So not only are they investing money in particular companies the way we just spoke of, but they also become owners of companies, and they are generally politically to the left, and they are pushing corporate boards even further into this ESG commitment, into this ESG space, and also into causes with which companies really have no stake. I mean, it doesn't really do a company good to wade into hot button political issues when it guarantees that the company is going to alienate, let's say, half of American consumers. And we've seen with with the Bud Light campaign, or with Target, or with any number of examples, even Chick-fil-A being the latest. When they wade into politics, they hurt their business, and it doesn't make good business sense to wade into political controversies that have nothing at all to do with your product, with your consumers, with your business model. But because these institutional investors, whether they're hedge funds, or whether they're BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, or some other form of institutional investor, they are pushing corporate boards to adopt policies and programs that force companies into politics. And this is destructive to civil society writ large, in my view, because now we can't even go to dinner with a friend without having the straws we put in our drinks be a political statement. The type of clothes we wear are a political statement. Everything is so highly politicized that we can't just escape the realm of politics and just meet on a face-to-face basis and get to know people as friends before we get into hot button issues. It's everybody has to wear their politics on their sleeve everywhere they go, and that's, I think, unhealthy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I've often said, I don't need my sneakers to have a social policy. I don't need my ice cream to have a foreign policy,
Yeah.
although some brands of ice cream do apparently these days. And I don't think that's what the majority of consumers want either. Uh, but we have, this is sort of applying the idea of what we call public choice theory to the private sector, right? So in public choice theory, we say that people who are politicians and government officials, they don't always act in a disinterested way. Often they're very tempted to implement policies in a way that benefit them personally, or benefit their class, their tribe, their social circle. And I think that's what's happening to a certain extent, with the sort of our sociological analysis, if you will, of the people who are running a lot of these financial companies. Is they believe in a lot of these center left and left wing policies, and all their friends do. The people that they go to the country club with, the people they hang out with, their friends, their in-laws, and so well, of course, everyone they know personally wants to weigh in on behalf of these controversial political issues that only half of the country, well, maybe only half the country cares about, then half of that remaining half feels strongly about one way or the other. So it seems obvious them, if you're the brand manager for Bud Light and you think Bud Light is too, I think what's the word that she used, the woman who was that manager, too broy or too fratty or that, well, I'm sure that the executive who is in that position probably did feel that way, but obviously the vast majority of their customers didn't. So that's creating this this mismatch in a way. So with an individual brand, obviously that brand can suffer the negative consequences of lower sales. It's a lot harder to have that backflow of negative opinion when you're dealing with a company that manages $10 trillion.
Right.
And so I feel like, it might be useful to publicize some sort of, sort of as stories, a sort of like example. Imagine if you were in this position where you work, on an oil platform in South Louisiana, and your retirement investment happens to be in a BlackRock managed fund. Well, you see this letter from Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, saying, "Don't worry, everyone. We're pushing all of the companies in our portfolios to decarbonize as quickly as possible." Well, how are you going to feel about your investment future and your career future if that's your job? But if you're a asset management executive, well, it's no problem for you at all, right? Because you'll just switch to investing in the alternative energy companies instead.
Yeah, well, so you said a lot there. First, on the public choice problem, the obvious reason why the biggest companies, the biggest bank, the biggest investment firms support ESG is because the costs of regulatory compliance, which are coming, the SEC has a new proposed regulation requiring all publicly traded companies to produce all these disclosures that are ESG related, and several companies have this. The EU has it. France has it. I mean, they're coming from all over the world. France's is actually not proposed. France is actually operationalized and instituted and active now, but most of the others are still in a proposed stage. But why would these big banks and big investment firms want and big companies want to do this? Well, because the costs of regulatory compliance are high for all small local business. They can't afford to do that. So they're able to absorb those costs and squeeze out the competition. And so, of course, this is just another barrier to entry. It's anti-competitive. The other thing that when you talk about BlackRock, which is, I assume you were referencing $10 trillion of assets under management, which is what BlackRock has. So I assume that was a reference to BlackRock. Is its entire business model is built around government. So, I mean, you look at like 2009 when the U.S. Treasury Department hired BlackRock to manage the toxic assets involved in the 2008 financial crisis. BlackRock handled the debt settlement of Bear Stearns. BlackRock has done business with the British Treasury, the Swiss National Bank, the European Central Bank, the government of Greece. I was just on a television program yesterday in Sri Lanka, in which the host was telling me about how BlackRock is now invested in the bond market there in Sri Lanka in ways that I was unaware of. But BlackRock's entire business model is based around this. In fact, during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve hired BlackRock to advise on how to stabilize the bond market. And as part of that agreement, allegedly, I don't know the details of this, but the Federal Reserve was able to buy ETFs from BlackRock under certain terms and conditions. So this is like sort of like the crystal clear case of I'll scratch my back, you scratch yours. This is cronyism at the highest level. And for some reason, there's just not more public outcry. I mean, there is a lot of public outcry now, and people are waking up to these issues. But the fact that this isn't just, on news screens everywhere and people aren't just outraged is itself surprising. I mean, people are people are getting, I don't want to use the term getting screwed, but they really are, in a massive way, and on a scale that was never possible before. Before we sort of had the globalization capabilities and technological capabilities that we have now. I mean, this is cronyism at probably a scope and scale we've never seen before in human history.
Yeah, I know. Our so our friend Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, is has been, neck deep in this sort of backlash against ESG the past couple of years, and probably his name was not a household name, when he first took over BlackRock, but is sort of becoming more so now, but not in a way that's going to necessarily generate any awards for him. So he was just at the Aspen Ideas Festival, this big confab of A-listers, and he was asked about ESG, of course, because his name comes up at the top of every conversation about it. And he was visibly chagrined and tired of hearing about questions like that, saying that he was ashamed to be part of this conversation now because it was, it's so departed from the high-minded ideals, that he supposedly had brought into it with. And he said that the investor letters that he'd sort of become famous for, the past several years, that have mentioned ESG and climate goals and things like that multiple times. He said, well, those were never meant to be political. Those were just about building long-term value, and so he is now who was once the highest profile poster child of corporate CEO pushing the ESG agenda, is now says he's not using that term anymore. He's backing away. Um, he's not going to stop any of the ESG adjacent policies. He's just going to stop calling it that and hope no one notices. But I think that, I mean, and that just happened, I think, a few days ago. He made those comments.
Yeah,
That is probably one of the high watermarks when it comes to us realizing, yes, there really is a substantive backlash against the sort of like, the UN agenda writ into every corporate charter that people are kind of waking up to and saying, wait, this is not the direction we want to go in.
I think that's right. I think Fink does not want to be associated with failure, and I think that the backlash is strong enough that people are realizing that this will ultimately fail. I think the vast majority of the world holds values and ideals that are antithetical to the values and ideals that the United Nations and that ESG generally support. I mean, if you look at Africa and the Middle East, and even large portions of South America, with the exception of the economic policy on social views, and much of Asia, they're very different from what's getting promoted and pushed by this ESG agenda, and there are a lot more people that support, I'll just use as a loose term, I'll put it conservative, but more traditional values. And if you say, globally speaking, there are a lot more of us than there are of them, then you have to know that the backlash, especially in a time of rising populism, could be it could be fatal to ESG. And so, the more people are aware of the disproportionate impact that ESG has on the developing world. I mean, we have friends at the University of Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, and this ESG has a horrible effect on developing countries. And I mean, think about it. You can't be somebody in a poor country and just go buy a Tesla or buy these. It's prohibitively expensive to comply with a lot of these climate regulations and standards, and some of which are not even realistic for even developing and advanced countries to meet. So I think that ESG was a fad that we're maybe beginning to see the end of. Now, I have ESG set as a Google alert, and every day I see articles by promoters of ESG and ESG activists saying ESG is here to stay. There's no undoing ESG. There's no going back. But to me, those are increasingly reading like desperate cries that they would be unnecessary to say and to insist upon if that were in fact the case.
If that were true, right? So, speaking of how times may be changing, we've had parents and business leaders out there, politicians, all sorts of people who have been fretting for at least 50 years, if not more like a century, that college students are, kids these days, they're becoming more hostile to capitalism and market economies. They're becoming more amenable to socialist ideas. They're drifting to the left. Uh, how much specifically about sort of capitalism and markets, not necessarily everything else in the range of economic issues or everything else in the range of like social and other issues, but how much do you think attitudes have really changed? Because I've read a lot of this history, I've read the social and political history, and you always have people complaining about the kids these days aren't are throwing away the grand lessons of history that we struggle to teach them. Now that doesn't mean they're wrong, but when you look at how things are trending, you see lots of students come across your campus. Where are we today when it comes to students thinking, oh, maybe a free economy is good?
Yeah, so I've seen studies saying, like, I want to say a few years ago, there was some study showing a decline in support for capitalism and an increase in support for socialism. And maybe that was true under the parameters of the study, or I don't know what they controlled for, or how they conducted the study and all that. But I don't see it on a day-to-day basis. Now, I work with lots of free market organizations, and not just on our campus, but all over the country and even internationally. And so I work with a lot of young people who already sort of share free market views. But even within our business school, students that really aren't ideologically committed or even committed to political parties, I just don't see them being sort of radicals for socialism or anything like that. Most of them just want to go out and get a job and make money and find a career. And it turns out that is sort of a pro-business position to take. And it sort of puts them at odds with a lot of these sort of anti-business measures. I mean, ESG, in the name of being pro-business, is really anti-business as it was traditionally and historically understood. You can't be a business and be opposed to profit maximization. I mean, that doesn't, you can't stay in operation without making profits. So this sort of demonization of the profit motive is a little bit disingenuous, because it's not just a little bit disingenuous. It's disingenuous because everyone knows that these people are making profits out of rhetoric, anti-profit rhetoric and things like that. It's a marketing ploy. It's a PR campaign with no underlying substance to it. They just basically are hoping to dupe people and trick people and that sort of thing. But among the young people that I interact with, most of them are really open and curious to different ideas. Now, I see online and on Twitter, I see videos all the time about students shouting down speakers and deplatforming speakers, and so I know it's out there, and I know it's out there, and it's widespread. It's not out on our campus. I don't see it here in Alabama really much at all, so I think there's hope, and I think young people are going to be drawn toward some of these free market ideas the more it becomes edgy and weird and sort of the underdog. That now there's a better opportunity than there ever was to sort of show, like, oh, look, like this free market thing is kind of cool, because it's demonstrably better for the poor and disadvantaged people in society, and it's so easily provable, especially by comparison to its counterpart, socialism or something like that, which we know does horrible things to people. And you look at how many deaths are caused by socialism and communism, and how by contrast capitalism improved the lives of people all over the planet and brought us all kinds of technological advances and made our lives easier and better. And now when these free market ideals become kind of edgy on campus, as the professors sort of have their own status quo and their own now, I guess, their own orthodoxy, you might see sort of the cool thing for kids to be doing is to rebel against that. Like, let's rebel against that and embrace this cool free market stuff. So I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic.
Well, yeah, well, that reminds me, you may be familiar with the famous memo written by Lewis Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice in 1971. He wrote this memo, which then got passed around to a lot of like conservative leaders and movement people, about how free market was the free enterprise system under in America was under attack. And so he laid out a long case of what he thought were the problems, and then he had a bunch of recommendations, including things like uh, education programs for students and litigation, and organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and corporations should stand up for what they believe in. Um, and and at the time, he listed various threats, and he named a few individuals he thought that were trying to move the country in the wrong direction, whether it's hippies, black power radicals, communist agents loyal to the Soviet Union, typical conservative stuff for 1971, right? Those people are not going to be your favorites. Um, but at the time, the sort of stodgy Republicans were still the professors. They were still the establishment, right? And we've come through such a as the communist theorists called it, the march through the institutions. They've marched through the institutions so much that everyone just assumes that in most colleges the left wingers are in charge, from the president of the university on down, all the tenured faculty, everybody. Right. And so it is, I think, it is a little in the environment that you were just suggesting, which is that the people who are free market people, who are pro-capitalist people, are kind of the underdogs and the outsiders now, whereas you have a and again, conservatives always like to call the people who were radicals in the 60s and 70s, who are academics now, the tenured radicals, right? Just they're not out there manning the barricades. They actually have a pretty subtle life as a tenured professor of sociology or economics or political science. But it's hard to see a professor, no matter how nice they might be personally, who's lecturing off 40-year-old lecture notes about why Marxism is so great, as the cool new revolutionary who's leading the next generation, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it maybe people like Powell and sort of the conservatives of the early 70s who are confronted by all this radical politics craziness, including bombs going off on campuses, much more dramatic than we have today, right? Bombings where there was one historian who wrote a book about this time and said bombs functioned as exploding press releases. They were so common that left-wing political groups set them off in American cities and on campuses, that it would be tough for someone from that era, I think, to kind of wrap their mind around how a lot of those people are today the sort of the tenured radicals, um, and how sort of like upside down that system has become, where all of the like establishment people are on the fringes practically, and all the people who were the radicals 50 years ago are they are the establishment now.
Yeah, if you want to be anti-authoritarian, anti-elite, anti-establishment, underdog, for the little guy, for the marginalized, disenfranchised, then today you've got to embrace markets, because all the major institutions, from the media to corporate America to the university system, all the centers of knowledge, they've been captured by sort of an ideological uniformity that does not admit of any dissenting views, and tries to enforce sort of an ideological conformity with very rigid, narrow parameters. And so the time is really opportune for there to be some pushback and for some disruption. And I don't know what that will look like necessarily, but I have hope that human beings tend to work through difficult periods, and I think we're in a difficult period. And I don't know what it will look like on the other side, but I do have hope for young people, because I think they're they're given an economy that is not what it should be. They're starting their lives in positions where they're having to break through all these barriers and overcome all these hurdles that were put in place by these previous generations that are very status and very burdensome and onerous, and that aren't, in fact, they don't do what they purport to do. They don't help the people they purport to help, and they, in fact, make the rich richer, so to speak, but not based on merit, not based on actually providing goods and services at higher quality or more efficiently and effectively, but based on sort of government intervention and government programs and government picking winners and losers and government rigging the system in favor of certain people and industries. And, young people are sick of that. I think they're the ones that don't benefit from it, the ones that don't figure out, oh, I can work my way into that system and benefit off of everybody else in a sort of a predatory, parasitic way. But I think a lot of young people, the impulse to want to do good and do the right thing and change the world, that's a good impulse to have. And eventually they'll come to the market side of things if they just evaluate the facts.
Well, yeah, and I've reviewed a fair amount of these polls, the past several years about capitalism, socialism, and big business and big government. It seems to me that what you know a lot of especially young Americans, what they want is a country that works, where they can get an education, they can get healthcare, they can have a place to live and not be buried under a mountain of debt for their entire life. And politicians with socialist sympathies, like our the squad up there on Capitol Hill, whoever they might be, if they tell voters that they can deliver that, well, I'm not surprised they get a certain attentive audience, right? Um, and so, I think it's absolutely incumbent on people who believe in capitalism and free markets to say, well, actually, the biggest problems are government policies that created these problems in the first place, and rather than pile 10 more levels of government spending and regulation on top of the ones that are already causing the problem, maybe we should start by getting rid of the ones that cause the problem. And I'm sure you've seen, probably a lot of our listeners have seen this great chart that's produced by our economic policy people our friends at the American Enterprise Institute. Where they have a chart that and it's the prices adjusted for inflation of all these various things, whether it's cars or education or healthcare, TVs or food, and so adjusting for inflation, you have a bunch of lines that go down, things like TVs, electronics, telephones. Those have gotten cheaper in real terms, even as the quality has gotten better, as you would expect in a competitive economy. But then you've gotten things, these other categories, very important categories of goods that have gotten more expensive, even accounting for inflation. And some of them are just skyrocketing. And it's all of the things that government policies have the most influence on, that government has messed with the market the most. So it should actually not be surprising. But of course, the response is always, oh, well, we need a government policy to fix that, not
Yeah.
get rid of the government policies that created it in the first place.
Yeah, there's always an assumption that that government is the answer for every problem, rather than some sort of in the face of evidence to the contrary. I mean, even when government does have issues. I don't know if you recall a few years back with the government needing Apple's help with encryption and protections. Like the government didn't have the capabilities to do it. They didn't know how to do it, so they had to go to the private sector to do it for it. I think just a realization that government is not the best answer. That in fact, typically it can't do whatever it is as well as the private sector could. So why wouldn't we turn to the private sector first? Part of it is, entrepreneurship doesn't presuppose answers. It goes back to the Hayekian sort of knowledge problem. We don't have, sort of centrally designed or planned solutions to every type of problem. No matter what type of experts you throw in there, they can't divine all these answers that innumerable acting agents in sort of a dispersed way can, and they can come up with they can send price signals, they can come up with ideas that sort of emerge from the bottom up, and not because we have a bunch of smart people in a room that could go figure out what's going to work best for everybody else and then try to impose it in some sort of blanket overarching way, and it never works that way. I mean, in one sense, it's easier to do that way because it's just a command model of control, but it's not going to be long term the most efficient because it's not going to work.
Mhm.
So that's a big problem.
Well, you've got me convinced. So that's we'll start with that.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I'm so glad that we have, the opportunity to bring not just all of our Washington D.C. think tank people together for conversations like this, but also people across the country. And it is a testament to a flourishing economy and the sort of economic growth and innovation that it fosters, that we are able to have this conversation like this for at such an affordable price point. You know, uh, using the software that we use here, uh, we are basically having our own television show and interview program that would have been, impossible, 20 plus years ago. Um, I know the I just mentioned the American Enterprise Institute. I'll mention them one more time. They have some of their old archival material because they've been around for a very long time, and they have like policy panels that they originally filmed and broadcast on television 50 years ago. Uh, People like Irving Kristol and some of their economic policy people back then. And it's fascinating to go back and see what people were talking about back then, but also breathtaking to think about what it must have cost to produce that 50 years ago. They would have had a television studio would have cost the equivalent today of millions of dollars to produce all of those and have them broadcast on television. So uh, I want to thank you, Professor Mendenhall, for being here with us today. And it is a wonder of capitalism that we're able to do all of this and push it out there on the internets, on the podcast platforms, on YouTube for people to listen to and watch.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.